All right, cool. What a way to start an episode. Just leading off with our technical prowess and expertise. Hey, Warren.
Yeah, uh, you really set that up nicely because I've for sure been having issues. But maybe I'll just ignore that for a second, jump straight to the point. We have a survey going for the podcast. It's up at adventuresindevops.com /survey, but you can see it everywhere. Please submit responses because if it's a good feedback for us, something critical and thoughtful, you'll win some AWS credits.
And if it's not,
Well, there's not a lot that I can do about it at that point.
um, if it's not helpful feedback, then just put some contact details in there and I will contact you and we'll have a good chat about it if you're so interested. I'm pretty excited today because we've got Paul Marston here with us as well. Paul, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you for affording me the time. Just to introduce myself, so I work for Anchor slash Web3. I head up the node operations. So basically 24/7 running of blockchain nodes for integration partners that we've brought on board, and also running, other nodes that we run specifically for our enterprise customers and other customers to access other blockchains, other networks. So yeah, thank you for having me. Nice to be here. Nice to meet you all.
Yeah, for sure. I'm looking forward to this conversation because well, for many reasons. One, I think it's super interesting to understand or just like to get some insight into what running infrastructure for Web3 looks like when you have like a Web2 background, because there are some different challenges. And I'm particularly excited to have you on the show because I'm very familiar with your work because at Polygon, we're a customer of yours and you run a pretty significant amount of infrastructure on our behalf. And do a fantastic job of it. I'll be upfront with that. Like we yeah, we don't even give a second thought to the infrastructure that y'all run for us because it's just always there. And and so I think that was one of the reasons I was excited to have you on this show because you've clearly put the time and effort into the project to figure out how to make these things run at scale. So there we go. So give us a little bit about your background before you got into Web3. What choices did you make in life that brought you to this moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. Similar to I've been in Anchor for a year now, and similar to as I mentioned in my interview before I joined, so I've had quite a different 10 years doing one thing, 10 years doing another. So yeah, I started out as an underwriter of all things, working in a call center, working on mainframe based, black and green screen terminals, effectively for a retail company in the UK, taking applications and then deciding if people got loans or not based on some score that was spat out of, let's call it an arbitrary scoring algorithm for people's credit scores. Um, and then sort of slowly moved on from there, doing more in-depth and more technical elements. It was mainly an operational role that was to start with, but more technical elements in the let's call it Web 2, that but specifically sort of financial services. Moving on to doing testing and analytics, requirements gathering for software builds, etc. And then I think the main takeaway from like about 3 or 4 years of that period was I started working on migrations for customers. So they would come to where I was working at the time, First Data, and we would effectively do gap analysis between what they ran today for credit card processing, loan processing, etc., and how different our system was and what we needed to do in order to uplift our system or change their processes to bring them on board. And I think one thing I will say is, and I even said this to my wife at the weekend, working in a fast-paced environment like financial services migrations, and I'm sure other migrations for other software, it really gives you a great background in dealing with things that you just cannot plan for. Every single event that we had, there was always something that came up that we'd forgotten about or hadn't been captured as a requirement, etc. And being able to think quickly, and because you have a set period where you need to migrate these things, right? People want to use their credit cards to pay for things. Being in that position, having to think quickly, act quickly, resolve issues, and move forward. It was always fixed forward. There was never any going back. Yeah, I think it sets you up for any for any role that you do in the future. So yeah, that was like migrations, and then I moved on to working on more digital focused products. That was the later part of my financial services background. I was working at Visa. I was lucky enough to work on the Apple Pay rollout in the UK when they came to the UK, working with Apple and various other tokenization providers after that as well. So that was good. And then yeah, on the Web3 side, so it's almost I shouldn't say this, but I'll say it anyway. But it's almost like a love story between me and this guy I met in Discord, and he's gonna hate that I've said that. But yeah, so me and Peace Stew or Peter, you may see him in Telegram, and he's all over Web3. But we met. I think it was probably 2017, back end of 2017 or 2018. We met in Discord for Horizon, the crypto. Um, and from there just hit it off. We had similar opinions. Not that Peter would say necessarily that my opinion would be correct against his, but we had similar opinions in how we should be setting up servers, provisioning Linux, running nodes, and that back then it was the secure node that Horizon had launched at that time. And yeah, we just had very similar approaches to things, and naturally that came together, and we actually ran a small startup for a short time. And then, as life got in the way of that, and that kind of dwindled out. Peter moved on and continued to work in Web3, came to Anchor. I was, at the time, I was finishing off a contract for a UK-based acquirer, so still doing some financial services work. And then I did another startup just a year prior to coming to Anchor. And then Peter got in touch and he was like, hey, there's a great opening here. It's very similar to what we've done previously. Why don't you come and join me? And yeah, and that's how I ended up here. And I'm just coming up to a year being in to Anchor.
Right on. Very cool. So for someone who's not spent a lot of time working in Web3, specific to like the infrastructure that powers it, what would you say are the most significant holy shit factors that they experience?
Uh, so from an infrastructure perspective, probably the scale. Certainly where we are, the number of bare and we're our selling point, our USP is run it on bare metal, get the best performance possible, have many independently working systems. So you're not going to worry about losing one, three, five, whatever. Your service is still online. And yeah, do it at a cost, do it at the right cost to meet all those factors. And yeah, so really the scale at which we provision hardware at Anchor versus any of the organizations I've worked for in the past, with the exception of probably Visa, I would say. Yeah, the scale of the hardware, the not so much the effort in managing it, but ensuring that you have, the right rollouts, the right Ansible playbooks to configure this host, that host, etc., and the right infrastructure as code in place. It's significant. And yeah, I think that's the main difference. I think the other element to it as well is just the sheer overhead of managing that on a 24/7, 365 basis. We don't have bank holidays in Web3. We did in financial services, and we used to have this thing called a weekend. That doesn't seem to exist in Web3. So yeah, scale mainly.
I didn't realize that was specific to Web3. I thought that got killed by COVID. That's my misunderstanding there. No, I think when you're talking about scale, like one of the things that um, really sank in for me was each of the nodes, because when you're talking about high availability, fault tolerance, redundancy, that sort of stuff, in a decentralized environment, what you're actually talking about there is every single node has to have a complete, accurate copy of the entire blockchain.
To the extent that it needs to serve its requirement, right? So we run different types of nodes. We have, which mainly come down into three categories: full node, which is limited state at the generally serves requests at the tip of the chain, and then we have the archive nodes, which is, as you point out there, yeah, are required to store state all the way back to the Genesis block and be able to serve that up on all day, every day, 365.
Yeah, for sure.
Just to add on to that as well, the amount of data you have to store, for an archive node, we're talking terabytes and terabytes. which for an independent service would be unheard of in the Web 2 world, right?
Right.
You would probably have many services consuming from an enormous database as opposed to that node over there having 5 terabytes, that node over there having 5 terabytes, etc. So that's another good difference.
So having transitioned from global payments infrastructure, working with like Visa and some other payments companies, into the Web3 world, uh, how like what sort of environment were you met with? Like, is it common for people to transition from Web 2? I mean, I see there's a lot of overlap in payments and financial structures within the Web 3 ecosystem. So, maybe there's some alignment there, or like, was it completely different? Unexpected things coming up left and right that you just hadn't had experience with, having been outside before.
Yeah, so great question. I think there's probably two areas where it differs quite a bit. So, like in the Web 2 space, a lot of the time there are lock-ins with vendors who sold you product, and with that comes additional bolt-on products that you take as an organization because you can build a cohesive and hopefully coherent platform to serve credit card traffic, loan traffic, whatever you need to, debit card traffic, etc. And in doing that, you almost make a decision about a lot of your infrastructure based on one key product that you need. And then as a result of taking that key product, you get all these other things as well. So you kind of mold yourself to working within those constraints of what those products have and what you've got off the shelf and what is the key product that you've usually bought. Whereas in Web3, I would say there's less of that. Obviously, from we're not buying it in the Web3 space. We're not buying in products that we run as such, or let's say a billing platform that we need to implement and run as part of some kind of processing platform. It's more that our vendors primarily are bare metal hosting providers who we deal with, and maintain good relationships with. So I would say there's more freedom to choose in the Web3 space, and we can dictate our own path more. I think the main differences between the approach to, let's say, development, release management, and let's say notification of changes and version increments, etc., in the Web2 space versus Web3 is Web3 it happens instantly, right? We can come in on a morning and a blockchain team that we've worked with can announce there's a hard fork tomorrow, and we've got to be ready. It doesn't matter if you're running 10 nodes, 48 nodes, however many nodes, the expectation is that you're ready. To contrast that with what would have happened in Web 2, we would have tested that for weeks. I was joking on a call with some guys the other day. They were talking to someone loosely linked to banking, let's say. I can't say more than that. And they were saying, oh, yeah, so they said it's a 6-month project. I was like, whoa, whoa, no. You've not worked in this industry before then. Every finance project starts out as a 6-month project. And then 3 years later, we're still working on implementing MVP. And a lot of that is, obviously there's decision making and, changes of tack, etc., and general evolution of what it is that you want to deploy and offer to your customers. But in some cases, your timeline for development in let's say the Web 2 space, the finance space, will be shortened, and you will have this huge chunk of testing that happens before things go into production. And I'm talking, business system testing, user acceptance testing, operational acceptance testing, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, I think there's more flexibility. We have more say over where we want to drive things in the Web3 space. In the Web 2, I would say it's more rigid, but I wouldn't necessarily say that's all bad. I think there are good practices and processes that we can overlay from certainly my experience in Web 2/finance with what we do and how we approach the Web 3 space.
Makes sense. So just to get a better understanding of what it is that you're sort of doing, would it be accurate to say you're like a cloud provider for Web3 companies that are running their own chains and you're hosting the nodes for them? Or this is a gross oversimplification of what I'm sure you're actually doing.
I mean, that doesn't that's not half bad in terms of a description. I think, if you coming in cold and taking that away, I think that's pretty accurate. My only aversion is the cloud thing. So yes, it's cloud because it's not at your home, but we explicitly don't, we have some critical services running in cloud infrastructure, AWS, GCP, etc. That's generally what I think people think of as cloud. Um, but we're all about bare metal, least latency and highest performance, if you see what I mean.
So now this is from my own understanding, like what's the benefit of using a provider that offers dedicated nodes for the chain that you're developing? Like, don't you have some sort of consensus protocol? And so all of your users are going to be, well, some set of the users are going to be running their own nodes anyway. How does that work? Like, what's the benefit? And I've seen like some of the cloud providers, AWS, et cetera, have pretty bad versions of managed blockchain things. And I have yet to understand why they do that. I'm sure they're not good. I'm sure you have some opinions about that as well. But like, I just don't understand what the point is.
Yeah, so to come back to the point that was made earlier on, actually, the if you take at source the fact that, let's say for a developer, they have to firstly understand whatever this Git repository is telling them in terms of how to set up a node. I think there are a lot of good developers out there who have that skill set, who can go from, like bootstrapping a Docker environment, running something in Kubernetes, etc., to then actually doing the code they want to do. But I think certainly there's a number of developers, and I don't want to generalize anyone here, but there are certainly a number of developers who simply want to hit an API. And let's say you need an Ethereum archive node or a Polygon archive node. You're talking about downloading for many days terabytes worth of data before your node is even ready to serve those requests. So yeah, so the simple answer is from a developer standpoint, it's just plug and play. You come up to our Anchor website, you register, you start consuming traffic. If you want a higher rate limit, you pay a little bit of money. If you want lots of traffic, then you come and talk to us about having an enterprise contract. So I think that's the main benefit for a developer. The other benefit, I guess, is that ongoing maintenance, version upgrades, the redundancy that we offer and the latency that we offer, that leads itself to an easier, let's say, development and testing timeframe for that specific developer.
So just, to sum that all up, basically there's a lot of parts that go from doing this, like from the software development to actually running the nodes, like for the network, for the chain that's out there. And that's a lot of infrastructure, a lot of process. And that's what's being automated, either helping with the development side or the testing or rolling out for what the new versions are that users should pull down and start running within their, whoever the node hosting providers are, whether they're general population or whether they're independent companies or whatever. Okay, so there's a lot of work that actually needs to be done there to make this work effectively, and you're solving everything in that space.
Absolutely, we are.
Cool.
Yes, I like to think so.
Yeah, I think really good perspective to put on that is if you're a developer who wants to create like a CryptoPunk NFT, the only thing you're interested in is selling cool little 8-bit graphics. And the barrier to entry to that without having access to hosted RPC nodes, the barrier to entry is you've got to set up a node that has terabytes and terabytes of data on it just to generate your NFTs. And that's where services like Anchor come in and take that barrier away from you or remove that barrier for you. One question I want to ask, just to elaborate on it a little bit. You mentioned a hard fork earlier. Can you elaborate a little bit on what a hard fork is?
Yeah, so in the simplest terms, it's a breaking change which requires a version upgrade. So essentially, a blockchain will run to a particular block, and at that block time, the protocol is in the network, how the nodes talk to one another. They will undergo a breaking change, which means unless you're running this new version of software, your node is basically going to sit there stalled and isn't able to communicate with the others, peer with them, and then propagate blocks and receive transactions, etc.
So I've always looked at this as imagine the blockchain is your database. And so a hard fork is where you make a non-backwards compatible change to the schema of the database. And all of the clients of the world need to decide how they're going to interpret that new schema of the database. I don't know. That's always worked for me. I don't know if that's accurate, but
That
that's been my.
no, there's no harm in that description. Yeah, absolutely. I think the key element you've got there, right, is that it's a breaking change, and that yeah, that's the main thing.
Yeah, and I think the unique constraint to it is that the decentralized aspect of it, because when you hit that block, you're now dependent on everyone who operates a node on that network, or not everyone, but a majority of the node operators on that network to adopt that change and implement it. Otherwise, you end up with a network that now has multiple people claiming that they have the latest block.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, it's an interesting thing here because in, let's say, the Web 2 world, uh, if you've exposed your internal database to your customers and they're, making, I mean, no one would ever do this, right? And no one ever did this in the history of the world, uh, for sure. But, your customers have access to the schema, to the underlying data that you have in your database, maybe with their own special username and password. And you make a schema change there. I mean, in the Web 2 world, I just can't ever fathom a story where you like go around to each of your customers and are like, okay, we're going to make a change. I need you to, change your software to actually support this. And having worked in a bunch of these companies where we even had an API, REST or, something else, getting your customers to actually make a change and start using the latest version is, I mean, that's a gargantuan task that I don't think I ever saw a company actually do successfully. Oh yeah, we'll just make a breaking change and get all our customers to update was yeah, easier said than done. And I feel like in the blockchain world, you actually end up in this state where you have customers, I'll call them customers, not really customers, right? The end users who are utilizing the chain will have still been using the previous software version, which doesn't understand what happens after the fork. And that's sort of what creates this maybe two future chains for whatever you're utilizing.
Yeah, it's kind of a leader follower mentality, isn't it? I think, and ultimately, the developers and the foundations of these networks are free to choose how they want to push the protocol, and really, who is it is their choice. Whereas in the Web 2 space, in a financial setting, you possibly have shareholders and who are big customers and all this kind of stuff. So it is, yeah, that's another good point. Change management and management of external customers who consume your service. It's much more. It was much more complex to manage and much more bigger a task to get them ready for those new releases, as you've alluded to, than in the Web 3 space. You know, you're either on the train or you're not on the train, unfortunately.
I mean, there's like a huge, I feel like there's actually quite a difference in perspective here because in Web 2, the customers don't really necessarily influence each other, right? Like what one customer is hitting your version 1 API and different customers hitting your version 2 API. There's not motivation for them to switch other than the value of using a later version. But in the Web 3 space, they likely want to be on the same network or within the same network on the latest version because there is cross communication between different users of the nodes. I mean, they're all contributing to the same ledger or chain in a way. So they're not doing it in isolation. And that pretty much means as a blockchain company that's or creating anyone who's creating a chain, you're just writing the software that you think a majority of your customers want, which I hope you're doing if you're not in the blockchain world, but you almost have to be doing it because if you do it and the majority don't accept the whatever happens after the hard fork, you did all that work for sure. Nothing. You can't force them to migrate.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. I think the main difference to call out here is that generally when the breaking changes come, they will impact an element of the network or the way a certain way that you configure a node or that you can how you stake tokens for that particular network or that kind of thing. Whereas something customer facing is much less likely to happen. And what I mean is, it's there are fewer changes for the API that faces the customers that they're consuming, individually. Generally, if it's going to be EVM compatible, it's always going to be EVM compatible, and all those methods available in various namespaces generally perpetuate, and they don't change. What you will sometimes see, and again, as you mentioned, you may see you may see a new method or a new namespace open, which gives you some other API that you can play with. That can happen. But yeah, I think generally the hard fork changes aren't things that our customers would see or be aware of unless we missed one and our nodes were stopped, right?
Yeah, I think another way to think about that is that it's much more community driven for Web3. As a Web2 business, it's probably a horrible example, but like Visa could say, you know what, we're not going to support the US dollar anymore on April 1st. We'll deny all transactions priced in US dollars. And as a customer of Visa, you can go, damn, okay. And you can look for someone else. You can take your business somewhere else, but that's your only option. And in a Web3 world, you can propose a hard fork saying, hey, we're dropping support for this. And the Web3 community can look at that hard fork and either adopt it or say, you know, I don't think we're going to go that direction. And the community just doesn't adopt the change, and goes off and operates on their own.
I can see the argument there. I think the contrast of what you're suggesting in Web 2 versus what you're suggesting in Web 3 is significantly different. We're
I,
not going to do US dollar anymore on Visa.
I mean, I
Right?
actually yeah, I actually do wonder if you have any like statistics or known information about this because I mean, I think the world has seen enough public hard forks, and the way most of them, as far as my experience has gone, I guess the hard forks I know of primarily are the ones in Ethereum. The world pretty much adopts the majority of the change, and I wonder how many companies that are running chains end up doing some sort of hard fork where it's get rejected by the community. Like does that ever happen? Is that the majority and we just don't hear about it?
I don't know. I don't think so. I mean, isn't that the background of Ethereum versus Ethereum Classic of sorts?
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't. That was so long ago. I can't remember exactly how that happened. But
That's definitely the community saying, what happened here is not okay, and just
yeah,
rejecting. Oh, and
yeah.
arguably it's the same thing that happens with any hard fork, though, that goes through. There's also still the proof of work Ethereum chain that's out there that people are performing work to mine the coins and get value out, but it's such a small part of the majority of compared to the size, the number of nodes that are being added to the uh, current Ethereum network.
Yeah, indeed. So, I mean, we had the Pectra upgrade recently on Aleski, one of the Ethereum testnets. Sorry, I should mention if people don't know. So, I mean, that was problematic because there are multiple different client options you can run. This is another, rabbit hole that we can run down. Um, and just to give you a bit of background there, so primarily we run Aragon clients, what's called Aragon, to run our archive nodes, and then full nodes we generally run, Geth, which is, as you're probably aware, the main Ethereum client. Well, main, I guess it's debatable based on what side of the fence you're on. But yeah, there are essentially three. There were there were a number of changes that happened for Pectra, which were implemented correctly in some clients and not in others. Now, the deep technical understanding of it all, I couldn't go into and tell you, but we ended up in a position where, for a couple of weeks, probably slightly longer, we had nodes that were going off in one direction and others were going in another direction. And I think it was a difficult time, put it that way. And so I think the most important thing for these foundations is that they have, all of their distributed or decentralized developers, even if they're even if they're developing clients, not just running nodes, singing from the same hymn sheet and taking the same route forward, if you will. So yeah, I think that's a good example of where we've seen problems on a hard fork. And there are other examples where, some other chains, like the Cosmos SDK based chains, where you can't upgrade them ahead of time. So it's like another thing. Contrast it to Web 2, right? So in Web 2, you've got like 8 weeks, I don't know, or something to test your new client version. The Cosmos SDK, it's like on this block you upgrade. Wow, so I can't do it 2 blocks before, 10 blocks before, a week before. No, on this block you upgrade. So it's, you don't get the benefit of testing and seeing how resilient that latest version of code is.
Do you, the thing that keeps going around in the back of my mind right now is security. Now I think that's sort of my specialty, so I tend to get in this area very quickly. But I know that there's a lot of madness in the world right now with things like S bombs and supply chain attacks. But so whether or not or how bad it is a separate question. But I'm sort of curious, like the comparison. Like, do you feel like uh, malicious attackers coming in through a supply chain attack on the tools and technology that you're utilizing to run your platform is significantly worse or similar to what would happen if you weren't while you're working at Visa, although that's payment, so it's that's sort of bad in a different angle, but compared to privacy data that a web 2 app may be storing.
That's a good question, which I probably don't have an in-depth answer for. But I think, if you're talking supply chain attacks, in as much of I consume or I buy some, either I bring in some open source software or I buy a product from someone and there is some kind of attack vector embedded within that.
So it's whether or not you see higher supply chain attacks through, say, like dependencies or open source technologies that you're utilizing to manage or monitor your data center compared to the ones that would be utilized in a non-Web3 world. So, if I run my own data center, if I'm AWS or whatever, and I'm using Grafana or Nagios or whatever someone, no one wants to talk about using, are they the same technologies? And so you have the same concerns, or are they modded differently? Are they targeted for Web3? And so do you find that the processes that you would put in place in your company would be different from the ones that would be, say, up and running in, say, a Visa or another large organization?
Yeah, got you. So I would say reassuringly, that's one of the areas where Web 2 and Web 3 tend to not differ all that much. I think approaches to security are fairly standard. And thankfully, we've got, well-defined external best practices that influence how we should go about doing business, both in Web 2 and Web 3. We've recently done a SOC 2 audit as well, so we're fully SOC 2 compliant, and we're being audited for that, which I think is another tick in the box that we're doing the right things, taking the right approaches, etc. But in terms of the tooling, I would say there's many similarities. We use Grafana to monitor our nodes, report on their status, their height, how many requests per second they're managing, etc. So from that perspective, I think a lot of the tooling is similar. I think basically the answer to that question is no.
There's nothing special you're doing compared to what you would be doing if you were in any other vertical or using any
Exactly.
different technology stack. Cool. So I hinted at this before, actually. How good are the like the public cloud? I hate that term. Public cloud supported hyperscalers manage blockchain solutions.
I've never used one. So it would be unfair of me to comment in terms of, let's say, giving you a bad impression of them. I would expect that they have good documentation based on the providers who develop them. I suspect they've got good developer support and run relatively stably. And were I able, if I could say that about all of the blockchains and the nodes and the networks we ran, it would be a wonderful thing. But I couldn't say that. So from that perspective, I think as an organization, if you're looking to do something on blockchain that doesn't necessarily need to be public and decentralized, they're a good option.
I'm just bringing up here my comparison of when someone in the UK says something versus the English that Americans are supposed to understand. Because there's quite a nice comparison chart there. But no, I think that's a good point. And so maybe I'll extend it a little bit. Do you find that the conversation of using hyperscaler nodes comes up, or it's just like not something that's frequently talked about? Because I don't personally understand the use case for what they're providing, and I'm just interested if there's like a whole world that I've just never been exposed to.
Well, I think again, I think they're targeted toward someone who let's take any financial services company. They don't want to buy consumer hardware and run it in their data center, right? They want to go to to IBM or to Oracle or to some big blue chip organization who's going to say, yes, you can have that bit of kit, and with that bit of kit, I'm going to give you 3 years unlimited on-site support, free replacements, etc. You can't. There isn't there isn't a blockchain stack you could take off the shelf necessarily that has that sort of service layer wrapped around it, ready to go. And I think that's why a big enterprise type customer may look to approach an implementation with one of those managed services, or not necessarily managed, but broadly supported and known stacks, I guess. Now, in terms of conversations, I generally get involved in integrating new blockchains and ensuring that the ones that we cater to now are scaled correctly in the right locations, etc. So, personally, I haven't been involved in those conversations. I'm sure they will happen. I'm sure our sales team are covering all manner of things that I couldn't even dream up that are being discussed in the Web3 space. But no, not specifically. I haven't been approached to integrate one of those.
What always scares me with my sales team is on the innovative side, because that means things that you clearly haven't developed yet are things that are going to be coming down the pipeline.
Could we do this? Or now we've got X and Y, can't we make, I don't know, Z? Not necessarily, right?
Well, I think this goes both ways. I think and I think we talk a lot about this on Adventures in DevOps, so the audience is probably sick of hearing about it. If you haven't pulled your customers in to ask them where to innovate, then you're probably building things that they don't care about. But if they're innovating, then they should be ahead of you. And so I think what the important thing is being able to move quickly once you've identified. So a sales team doing a good job would mean that they're able to figure out what they can promise that hasn't been built yet. Because if they're promising things that can't be built, that's where the issue is.
Yes. Yeah, indeed. Maybe, there's an element. The Web2 space was full of that, I would say. We used to always pull out this diagram when we first met with clients, and it was I think it's a typical Accenture diagram, the rope swing where, this is what they wanted. This is how the requirements were gathered. This is what the developers built, and this was the MVP that got in it. It had all the elements of a rope swing, but it ain't a rope swing.
It's such a great meme. If you haven't seen that, maybe we can put it in the show notes for you because it's just so fantastic. So, Paul, one of the things I wanted to ask you is how many different chains are you supporting at Anchor?
If I think about my most recent table, I think it was over 100 cells. Now there may be, 100 rows. I still make my own notes manually, right? Even in the Web3 digital space, I'm still making a Confluence table just to keep things organized. But yeah, it's well over 100. I couldn't give you an exact number because I think even today one of my team has been finishing off implementing one. So yeah, it's constantly evolving.
Another way to look at that is it's 100 independent products that your team is supporting. And then we've already talked about the issues with hard forks and making sure that they're staying in sync and operating correctly. So you're doing that across 100 different products, which seems like a lot to take on.
It is that now there are various ways. Let's say one approaches that, and let's say teams might approach that, but for the most part, there are only a handful, let's say, of unique clients that blockchain teams use. And so what I mean by that is, Aragon is a perfect example here. We can use that for Polygon, we can use it for BNB Smart Chain, we can use it for Ethereum, etc., etc. And even some teams have taken Aragon and made an early, I don't know, it's test and prod, right? So it's like an op Aragon that we can use on the optimistic rollups, etc., etc. So there are obviously, it's a good word we used to use in the Web2 space, synergies and ways we can converge. It's lovely buzzwords. How you approach things, right? So let's say, for example, you need to host an op rollup, or even one of these most recent Aragon 3, even the Aragon 3 client they've recently released. You could write a Docker Compose file, and if you had enough environment variables in that Docker Compose file, you could take it and run one chain with it, and then you just create another environment variable file and run a second chain and run a third chain, etc. So yes, it is an overhead. I won't lie that obviously we're monitoring 24/7. We get alerts, and from that perspective, it does seem like a lot, but there are learnings from running one chain that we can overlay on another. There are ways to make certain clients behave better when they're peering and syncing, and being able to stay at the tip. There are ways that we can configure clients that make them better in terms of responsiveness and latency for various requests, via JSON RPC. And all of those learnings you then roll out when you do the next integration of a similar client, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, it is a lot. But we have to take from that what we can and reuse wherever we can.
When you have hundreds of 100 products that you're supporting here, it's not like you have a multi-tenant solution where you have 100 customers and they're all utilizing your product in a consistent way. I assume you have to build integrations into each of those products to be able to understand how they're working, and not all of them are using the same protocols to do the management. Like it's like if one company had gRPC and another company was using some weird other protobuf format, and then there's HTTP, and then there's someone's using REST or some other, like each company is basically conceiving of their own protocol.
Yeah, it's a good call out. So actually, generally the conversation we've had has been around the operations of blockchain nodes. Obviously, the other elements of what we do here at Anchor is we built our own cloud native, multi protocol supporting load balancer, which is again, it's a distributed load balancer in all the locations we want to be. And we're building out our own global network as well. And so we can there, as I mentioned, there are similarities in how we run nodes because they're similar clients. Generally, it's configuration and best practice approach to making those run the right way. But in the load balancer, from the load balancer side, because obviously that serves the customer requests that are coming in, we do have to do differentiation there as well. So as you mentioned, you have like an Ethereum like client, so it talks roughly, we call that, oh, it's an EVM client, right? Or you get some nuances to that, it's EVM light, or it's EVM but only up to a certain point, so it doesn't have these other new namespaces and new method calls, etc. And we're able to we abstract from that detail of the node, effectively like a schema, into the load balancer. So the load balancer, knows what that node can speak in terms of protocols, and what it can speak in terms of, the APIs and the actual messages within that protocol. Yeah, there's a lot that we need to have in place and maintain. But thankfully, we're at the point now where generally the changes in the load balancer level are incremental. And generally, the changes that we make in terms of the approach to running the nodes is again, it's incremental, and it's built upon the knowledge that we built up over the last few years, just running these nodes all the time.
From my understanding, like load balancing is not load balancing as we think about it in a Web 2 world, right? In a Web 2 world, you know, is the health check cool? Yeah, the health check is cool. We're pretty much okay to route traffic to it. But in the Web 3 world, it's more than that because you have your health check. Yeah, the service is up and available and responsive and able to take requests. But then you've got a follow-up question. This node is operating, but is this node fully synchronized with the network? And if it's not, you can't route traffic to it. And then the third aspect of it is what's the request that's coming into the load balancer? For example, is it asking about a recent block, or is it asking about a really old block that's only going to exist on archive nodes? And so now with that information, you know that there's only certain nodes that you can route this request to give the caller the correct information back. And so that adds a whole new layer of complexity to load balancing.
I've got the analogy, I think. So if we go on the databases, like could you imagine running Redis and Cassandra and MySQL and an Aurora database and Elasticsearch and having like whatever consensus protocol you had for figuring out like which is the primary nodes, which ones are secondary, and where to route requests automatically to the appropriate shards, and also manage the infrastructure for that with only using a single piece of technology rather than using dedicated pieces, like separate pieces. Like that's as I see the problem.
Yeah, and so maybe it would be I have many Redises as Redis. What's the Redis eye? I don't know, red eye.
You get to coin the term. I think you are the first person to have.
So yeah, maybe you would have many of a particular database instance type, let's call it, and then many of another one and many of another one. But yeah, I mean it's challenging. There's not a day goes by where we're not discussing um, what the algorithm should be to load balance requests, right? And I don't mean that in a way that we're immature and we're trying to build the algorithm. It's more every day we learn something new. Every day we learn, or we get a new customer who interacts with our service in a slightly different way, and they do maybe they do a slightly different sequence of calls to ultimately maybe achieve the same output as a different customer. And what does that mean in terms of how their requests are handled coming in and how they're routed? And I think this shouldn't be taken as a failure. It's like it's an acknowledgement of effectively we don't believe there's a perfect load balancing algorithm. I mean, I don't. I'm sure that some of the younger members of the team would have their own subjective opinion about that, right? But I think you get to the point, given the volume of requests, we're talking tens and tens of thousands a second, right, of requests that are coming in. To be at 99.999%, that's achievable. Perfect is aspirational, we as we discuss internally. And so we have, anyway, to get back to the question. So yes, it's complex. And yes, there is, let's say you need to have a more fine-grained control of where you route a request based on a better underlying knowledge of what that request is and what its intended outcome is. The perfect example is the one you gave. A request comes in, it's for I don't know, let's say block 1000 on Ethereum. That's got to go to an archive node. That block is, the state for that block and all the information is not going to be on a full node, and we have to know when it's coming in. We have to interpret that and route it to a particular archive node. So we have rules in the load balancer that are geared toward routing those requests correctly.
I think some people may be cheering, and I think others are gonna regret that I asked this question. Uh, has AI had any impact on the Web3 world for you?
There we go. There's the magic word.
So you know what, I listened to the last podcast, and it's interesting how you almost tentatively or sheepishly approach having this question, bringing this AI question in. So I'll be honest, right? So from a personal standpoint, had I embraced the last, oh. in the last, to be honest, in the last startup I was in, if I'd embraced AI, I would have done stuff in half the time, and I didn't at that point. And more than anything, that was so. This is just a personal tale. I'll go on. I'll go on to Anchor stuff in a moment. More than anything, that was because I would needed to make sure I knew how it worked. Right, I was the only guy, or one of a very small team doing development, and I felt like if I could save myself, I don't know, 3 weeks, 6 weeks here, but what's that going to cost me when I try and maintain this and operate it in a production environment, for customers? So I shied away from it a bit there. Now at Anchor, we have embraced AI. At the moment, we're learning, and it is learning from us. It understands blockchain. It understands that we've got a load balancer. It understands the end goal of what we're trying to do. But there are still some instances where we're asking it questions and we get a confident answer that we know isn't right. So yeah, we're just working to try and feed it more and effectively take away some of those easy to answer questions or easy to diagnose problems, and we allow the moniker to do that for us, and we can ask her questions to try and assist us troubleshooting and assist us with helping the customer. But it's early days, and I can see it it's already evolved massively, and I can see it only, the curve is exponential with these things, right? I can see it getting much more capable as the months go on, and I think we'll be leveraging it more and more. We like it, and I think used for the right thing, it's a great tool.
When you make statements like that, it seriously makes me question if I might be an AI because I'm always super confident and also at the same time usually super wrong.
You're just another person on the internet, right?
Right. So what do you use for, what's your tool stack from an ops side look like? Are you guys using a lot of Terraform, Ansible? Do you do Kubernetes stuff? What's that world look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So we use Terraform. We on the NodeOps side generally we've created our own template, if you will, that we consume and create Terraform from, that we then go off and manage the state on the hardware through, if you see what I mean. So um, it's similar to what I mentioned before about if you have a Docker Compose file with enough environment variables, you can spin up any number of networks. And we've done a similar thing in terms of how we interact with how we launch nodes based on using Terraform to do that launcher, but having this template in place to simplify things effectively. Um, and yeah, we use Ansible, we use all day long. We use AWX, to schedule playbooks running across hosts, etc. To push out security updates and that kind of thing. But yeah, we split it. So we have some nodes that are, fully, if not close to fully automated, and we have others where our preference is to effectively approach the bare metal manually and set up the node in such a way, because it's so different from the other ones. We set it up in such a way that we can do it right for a start, and then obviously create our own documentation off the back of that about how to maintain that. So yeah, we do use quite a bit of HashiCorp stuff. I think the last podcast I listened to, I was reading about Open Tofu after that, because someone was talking about Open Tofu quite a bit. So I was actually reading about that this morning. Um, so yeah, HashiCorp stuff. And then in terms of other automation, generally it's running. Oh, sorry, Kubernetes you mentioned. We do run Kubernetes. Um, not for the RPC nodes, I would say. We use it in other areas of the business. So where we want, bare metal, close to bare metal performance, least latency, high capability in terms of serving requests, we'll generally, either do it via the auto deployer, which is powered by, which we use Nomad behind, another HashiCorp product, or we'll do them manually. And then if it's a lighter client and recently launched like a small test net that we don't expect to run for ages, we'll use Kubernetes. So, and there are other areas of the business that also use Kubernetes outside of the node operations. So yeah, we use quite a few of those orchestration tools and HashiCorp products.
Right, and it seems like there's probably an adoption phase for those as well. Whenever you bring on a new chain, doing things manually, kind of hand curating it to figure out what the best set of configs and the right things to be monitoring and tuning for this are. And then as you learn that information, you start turning it over to your automation.
Yeah, absolutely that. Yeah. So one of the things, actually, that was my surprise this morning. So I've been working on a new blockchain integration, and so usually when I do the manual one, I'll deliberately set it up so systemd or Docker doesn't restart it automatically, because I want to know when that, from the point I start it, I want to see it fail and see what that longevity is, if you will. And yeah, that was my surprise this morning. Like four nodes were down, and I was like, "Oh, why are these down? Surely I've set these to restart." And it's because I'd set them to not restart, so I could see the point at which they fell over. But yeah, it is an element of that. What we generally do as part of the integrations now, and this is something I put in place since I started. So we want to make sure that we hit, if we're going to do manual nodes, and we agree that that's going to be how we run most of the nodes, we always have at least one or two automated nodes as well. And that simply is because as long as we have the template in place to do the automation, we can scale at will. We can just come up and put another template in with various variables, and we can scale some others. So yeah, we don't like to leave ourselves in a position where we've kind of got nowhere to go, or we have to set up another host manually in a specific way to run this particular blockchain node. So yeah, it's exactly that approach.
So where we left off last time with how Web3 is going, we had NFTs, and I think the general population failed to understand NFTs in any capacity. So that went well. But I am curious, like what the where the innovation is at today. Like where you see that, either where it's currently at, or what's coming next that is super interesting for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And similar to the break that I had when when I wasn't working with Peter and he came to Web3, when I asked him, "Oh, what's happened? Has anything changed?" Actually, his response was, "Well, they're just Linux services, right?" And I was like, surely there's something more than that. But of course, the L2 space had evolved in that period where I hadn't been working explicitly in blockchain. But I think while that might not necessarily be where we see the greatest innovation, I mean, I might be wrong. I see that for me and my team, I see that as a great learning opportunity because there are lots of new toolkits that are available and new ways of running L2s and soon to be L3s and who knows how many layers that we're going to see. And so from my perspective, as well as let's call them the general integrations we do for blockchain networks, it's good for me and my team to have access and be exposed to these layer twos because it's a good learning opportunity. They also we run this roll up as a service where you can literally rock up, define your chain parameters, and launch your own blockchain if you want to as an L2. And yeah, I think that makes it so accessible for people. So I think that is where we're going to see a lot of innovation, and certainly, for me and my team, I think it's where we're going to learn a lot more and have access to these other technologies, other development stacks, etc.
Okay, so you've gotten to the point where you're actually outside of my area of understanding. When you say like layer two or layer three, are we talking about like Lightning Network? Like, what does that actually mean in the context of a blockchain?
And L2 allows you to run a blockchain which at various intervals generates and stores state in a transaction on an L1. So a lot of these use Ethereum as their L1, which is effectively the data availability layer. So if you needed to, let's say, bootstrap another L2 node, you could based on the state that's been stored on the L1. I'll be honest, this is going past some of my understanding, but effectively, but effectively, an L2 allows you to sort of branch off and have transactions between wallets, etc., and all of that happens on the L2, and periodically it then records that state on the L1. Now the difference is the reason for this is, obviously you can only do a certain number of transactions per second based on the block time and the size of the blocks on each of the blockchains. Now, if you separate all that transaction activity onto an L2 and only at various intervals record that state onto the L1, it means that you've got less going on the L1, and therefore, in theory, you can have many more transactions with fewer confirmations and therefore transactions on the L1. So people call it block space, lots more block space and lots more transactions. But I shouldn't say more than that because someone might say, you don't know what you're talking about. So don't go on these podcasts again.
Well, I think we'll definitely let you back on, but I think we're not the official keepers of that. But I will ask you here. I always had this fear that it's sort of like you have your enterprise service bus, and now you're building some microservices on top of that, and they're storing intermediary state in memory. Like for these higher layers, there must be some risk with the layer collapsing in some way, or creating a conflict between different isolated parts that are on the same layer that would cause a conflict on the base chain. And like, how does that get resolved, or is that even a problem that is concerned?
That's a deeply technical question, which I'm trying to think the best way to dodge. So
You can say anything because I honestly still to this day don't have the answer to this question.
yeah, so I should do the AI trick, right? I should have just responded confidently.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I'll be honest, I haven't seen instances of that problem. I'm certain that they must exist. But if you will, I could almost theorize how it might work, but maybe that's a bit dangerous. But on even on an L1, you can get to a point where a longer chain is submitted with a greater number of blocks, and therefore it unwinds some of the other blocks in the chain, and that everyone follows the longer chain, right? So my understanding is it would work the same way with an L2. There could be a point at which the state hasn't been recorded, and therefore it kind of reflects back to the state prior to that, and then you build back up to what is this next state that it needs to be in terms of the transactions that need to occur, etc. But I mean, note to self, I'm going to do research on that one.
Well, I mean, there's the canonical, and you worked in payments, so maybe there's some insight here. Like, you don't want to have a consistent state amongst all users in the world that have a Visa credit card. If they're making a transaction, you want to bucket them. So, like, if you're in bank processing world, you want to allow people to send money to each other. Maybe there's a regionality. So your L2s only exist in one country, and the likelihood of cross country transactions is low. And when that happens, then you have to ensure that you have a consistent understanding of what the L1 chain is. But other than that, you just, you risk it because you're blocking transactions in some way that are happening to that chain outside. Now, you can't fully trust that because someone could be doing something in one of those other, independent, same layer. But I see that there are some opportunities there. But like, as you said, we can theorize, but we're not the experts on this. That's fine. I got it.
It's a deep, deep, deep rabbit hole.
Oh, yeah.
Well, indeed, and I think abstracting from the technical complexities of building a blockchain client and a consensus mechanism, that's what those technical people are for, I would say. But yeah, it's a
Right?
it's a great question. I think
That's a
the
polite way of saying it's someone else's problem.
Yeah, I hire someone to solve that for me, so I don't have
yeah,
to
yeah.
know.
I only see the problems when they occur, not necessarily how they intended to solve them.
You've got deep experience both in Web 2 and Web 3. So if you could share one piece of a Web 2 learning with the Web 3 crowd, what would that be?
So less haste, more speed. I think that kind of comes back to the point I made earlier on about rigor around processes, testing, um, time to adopt new versions, etc. That kind of thing. I think there are great innovations and great inventions in the Web3 space, but I think yeah, we one and even organizationally, we should afford ourselves the time to do them properly. And yeah, I mean that's kind of what I've been doing and saying since I came into Anchor. For me, right? So imagine for node operations, look, I don't care that you can update 16 nodes in 5 seconds. That is not what I'm here to do. I want to know that there's at least X number of nodes online at all times in these locations. So you do them one at a time, slowly, sequentially, but make sure you do it right and it all happens. So yeah, that would be my learning from Web 2 to Web 3. Less haste, more speed.
I think there's a corollary here because one of the, I think you mentioned this earlier on in the episode, that one of the ideas with Web3 is let's forget everything we did with Web2 and like start all over again. But there have been innovations, I think, in Web2 in the last 20 years that even like before that were discarded that would benefit people to sort of pay attention with. And I think there's this aspect of experience from cross industry. And I see that for like a lot of blockchain companies are like only hiring, you must have blockchain experience, must have, Web3 app development experience. And I'm like, okay, but for sure, experience outside of that would be really useful. And I think, especially around the processes, it's in a lot of ways, it's still software development, it's still product management, it's still, business intelligence. And I hate that term BI, but I'll use it here as an example. What you can pull from other companies. So I really like that, and I'm dying to hear the corollary to Will's question, though.
Yeah, the flip the question around. What is one thing that Web 2 could take away from Web 3?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I mean, do you mean specifically when with like a particular sector, or or generally, I suppose? I mean, so the flip to the answer is why wouldn't you just test everything in production, right? What do you mean? What do you mean less haste, more speed? I remember even in the Web 2. I mean, we did it in various roles in the past. I won't go into which ones they were. We've done tests in production where we literally dragged the business over the line and got them to let us put this thing in production and do the test. So I think on both sides, Web3 can learn from Web2 in terms of more rigor around processes, affording themselves the time to do things correctly and right. And similarly, Web2 can learn from Web3 in that regard. Be more open to innovation, embrace it more, and take more risks in some cases.
That goes back to the joke I made a long time ago that true CI/CD is Vim on a prod server.
My brother would love that. He always goes on and on still about Vim. And I was like, haven't you tried Visual Studio? And he was like, no. It's just VS
Is
Code
that
is
is that a Vim
fantastic.
plugin?
I remember the first time I saw Vim and I was watching over someone's shoulder. It was a share screen, and I was looking at him going, what is he doing? He's going to delete the slide. And because I was used to using Nano, thought it was going to be an absolute disaster. But
So there actually is maybe a slightly different tangent. I started to see this pattern where malicious attackers are utilizing public APIs associated with blockchain companies' technology to smuggle out encrypted data from their victims. So they'll take data from a victim's environment, they'll encrypt it with the public version of a key that they have, and then upload it to a public blockchain. And I'm curious if you've heard about this, if you've seen something like this, and you think it's a known problem. Like, I don't know what there's a solution to this, honestly. Um, and just like what can be done, because I feel like it's sort of these things where in the past we had lots of these data sharing sites where you can drop a file, or someone pirates a movie or something, or some music and puts it on there, and then they always end up getting shut down, and because they're a source for this illegal content. And I don't know that there's something obvious that can be done with blockchain technologies out there, which you have a public ledger in a lot of cases.
yeah, that's a good one. And we see to be fair, we see more and more blockchain based storage solutions coming, as the months and years go by. Honestly, I mean, we need to sort the users out, don't we? That's the problem. That someone is, that you're not going to be able to find me tomorrow onwards, right? Because someone's going to have hacked my computer and encrypted my data and put it on a blockchain network, aren't they? Now I've said that, but yeah, I think the problem, it's a pebcak, right? The problem exists between the keyboard and the chair in that instance. Now, if we could stop users being, if we could stop users being taken advantage of and having this information stored, and that's the root cause for me, and that's what we should go off and fix. I think in terms of, because I would say I would champion, the blockchain space doing these, publicly accessible data availability layers and hosting solutions. I think it's a good thing.
There was one, and I can't remember the exact details of it, but I think you'll appreciate this, Warren. There was a similar strategy, but instead of taking the data and uploading it to the blockchain, um, they would take it and then submit it as a transaction to the blockchain, but intentionally price it so low that it would never get mined. So now the transaction exists on the chain, but it never gets written to a block, so you can't really track it down that way.
And you read it out, you read the data out there because the transactions are being traced and monitored in the network. And then when it gets dumped, it's not on the chain. It's gone. And so you have to actually look at the analytics data of what had happened. It's not even,
Yeah.
available for all. That is ingenious. I hope there aren't any, people with malicious intent that are watching this podcast.
Oh, it's highly unlikely.
You never know. You never know.
Yeah, I don't know. It went way over my head.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably, if you do enough times, it will be sitting there that someone will like eventually, it's in the queue to actually get turned into a block. I mean, there was a great post a while ago about making databases out of things that should not be a database. So one of them was TC using ICMP pings. And so you put some data in the ICMP header and you send it to a random IP on the internet. and then you'll get the ping back with the payload, and you can use it. And so it's like an ephemeral database at that point. And they're like, that's super unreliable, but this is like an extension of this. This is like a whole system, built and designed to actually utilize this data in a reliable way.
Yeah, because you just need it to hold the data till you get out of the building or whatever.
Yeah, oh, I mean, in a lot of these cases, it's not you haven't trespassed like physically to
Right. Yeah, yeah,
abscond with the data,
figuratively.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're just basically, you've deployed some malicious tool through npm or PyPI or anything else. Someone downloads it, they lost their credentials, or you infiltrate an organization and you have some keys to the database and you upload those automatically. You just sit there querying all of the block scanners that report transactions for any single chain, and you just like, oh, there it is. There's my transaction. You don't even have to pay for anything, right? I mean, you can put like a minuscule amount of money associated with the particular chain, so you at least can get the transaction started. And other than that, it will never complete, and you don't have to worry about it because you just pull it off and you just scan and get the data.
Wow.
I hate it.
All right. Well, that seems like a good time to move on to picks now that we've shared that information with everyone.
Well, if it's pick time, then I guess I'm up first.
Bring it on.
Okay, so a few episodes ago, I started sharing my keyboard, and I think I got some questions about what the heck I'm actually using. So first of all, let this be the official pick for me. I use a Dvorak keyboard, programmer Dvorak on Linux, where I've remapped all the keys as well. So I highly recommend doing this. Like if you work in multiple currencies, change like the dollar on the keyboard layout to also do the euro sign and maybe the yen or won, like whatever you're utilizing. Like it's just so much easier every single time you want one of those. Like imagine if you had a magic emoji button on your keyboard. I basically done that, but I also want to share the keyboard because I absolutely love this. So what I have is it's a Logitech K295 silent keyboard. And this thing is so quiet. Like I can type on it while I'm on the podcast and no one will ever know. That's how quiet this is. And that's important because if I'm too loud, um, well, other people that I live with will find out exactly what I'm doing whenever I'm doing it. Because I am an angry typer.
Right on. Cool deal. Paul, what'd you bring for a pick?
So I inherited a number of records recently. If there's kids listening, these big black discs, 12 inch, 45s, 33s. Because my father passed away, and so we sold his stereo system. An old Silver Techniques thing it was, and so I've been looking because I wanted to get myself a record player. So that's my pick for today. So I think for two reasons. Number one is, like we need to not lose the tactility, right? I know a lot of people, everyone's all about digital and Web3 and all this like wonderful thing, but I think we're slowly losing possessions as people, and I don't think that's in some cases that's great, and in others I don't think it's that great a thing. So yeah, I want to get a record player, which is to play these old records that I have, and I may increase my collection. Now the particular record player is the interesting bit. Um, so I thought I'd try and look for something that was quirky, new, different. And you don't get that a lot with record players, right? It's usually on a stylus. Now I found this record player by a company in the Netherlands, and I think they're called Mini OT or Min IoT. And they have a record player which you can have vertical or horizontal, and it actually plays the backside of the disc. So if you imagine it plays it counterclockwise, and the neat thing is it scans the entire record, so you can almost use it as a CD once it's done a scan of the record. You can skip tracks, forward, backwards, etc. So, yeah, my pick is this quirky record player that I'm going to treat myself to hopefully in the next couple of months.
That's wild. So will it still let you play the Beatles' White Album backwards so you can get the satanic messages?
That's a good question. Well, it has this feature where you can push it to play, so maybe it allows you to drag it backwards. I don't know. That's a good question. I'll let you know. I'll let you know.
Right on.
I wonder, are there turntables that let you determine the direction of the wheel? I wonder if that's a thing.
I don't know. It was a rumor I heard back when I was a kid about the Beatles' White Album. All right, cool. So for my pick, it's funny because we didn't plan this, but I'm actually picking a tool called Super Whisper, superwhisper.com. It's audio input, so you don't have to type at all, and you don't have to learn a new keyboard layout or deal with RSI. But it's actually surprisingly accurate, because like every phone and computer now has some sort of voice transcription thing. And never in my life have I used the word duck, but Super Whisper knows exactly what I'm trying to say. And it's done a really good job. And you don't have to, at least in my experience with it, you don't have to slow down or just give it bytes at a time. You can just have a full-fledged streaming thought process and it captures it very, very accurately. So it's been fun to play with. And also will work locally so you can set it up so that it doesn't send whatever you're telling it back to their servers for training or storage or ransomware or whatever they want to hold you hostage for. Cool. All right, Paul, thank you so much, man. This has been a super cool conversation. I'm super excited that you came on and chatted with us about it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks very much for the time, and apologies for the internet issues.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, you got to come back on and let us know how the record player works. So we got to do
Absolutely.
that part anyway. All
Yeah,
right,
sounds great.
cool. Right on. Warren, thank you so much. Appreciate everything. And for all of our listeners, thank you for listening, and we'll see y'all next week.